Cool. So yeah, welcome everyone. Welcome back to another Fireside Chat. Here we're joined with Linda from 23andMe and also from the Brainstorm Research Foundation. For me personally, your work in biotech and like personal genomics is applicable to all of us as humans because we're all united by like a common biological makeup, right? And also personally, your work it's really close to home because my grandfather had Alzheimer's and actually passed away a couple years ago. So I think it's fair to say that everyone from all of us at HackMIT are really in awe of your work, and we're super excited that you could be here today. So yeah, if you could go ahead and give us some background on like what you do, that would be great.
Yeah, so in fact, Brainstorm was something that I did out of 23andMe, and it was partly because my father-in-law had passed away with, and he, Alzheimer's is one of these weird things where it doesn't really necessarily kill people, but they just decline so much that he actually died of a broken hip and then got sepsis. But it was just like, you see these people just sort of slowly falling apart, including their memory. And so when I left 23andMe, I felt like we just didn't know enough about the disease. And so, and kind of to the foundational story for 23andMe, the whole reason I started that company was to build a larger research database. That was really the whole impetus behind it, because I'd been working in the genetics research space for many years. And the biggest problem over and over again was statistical power. The studies were too small, and we just didn't have enough people enrolled in studies to actually make any progress. And so that combined with the fact that I actually went to a trade show or a conference, and they had one of the exhibit halls, and they had this one little table with this company showing off these saliva kits. And I was like, well, what's that for? And now it seems so obvious, but at the time it was like, well, you can get DNA out of saliva just like blood. And I was like, no way, that won't work. That can't work as well as blood. And so I took it back to the company where I worked and gave it to the scientists and said, well, why don't you give this a shot? It would be pretty interesting if we could get DNA out of saliva. And so they're like, sure, well, Linda, you be the guinea pig. And so I was like, all right, I guess I'll spit into this thing. And I did that. And then a couple of weeks later, I went down and asked the scientists, like, well, did it work? And they're like, oh my God, it worked beautifully. And then the light bulb went on in my head, like, well, if it worked, that means you've got my genetic data sitting on these computers here. Can I have it? And they looked at me like I was crazy, like, well, why would you want your genetic data? And it was just this instant feeling of, oh my God, this is something that it's about me and it's my information and I want it. And that's where it triggered all of these different things that came together for the founding of 23andMe. So again, when I left and then I looked at what was going on in the research of Alzheimer's, it was just very clear that we needed way more data. It was a data problem more than anything else, like most things in life, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so 23andMe, it seems like it was kind of founded on like two separate like ends. Like one was the need for more data, and the other one was that, if I give somebody my genetic information, I should be able to kind of see what's up with that too, right?
Yes, exactly. And sort of that human curiosity around what am I going to learn? And I have a great story so we had this amazing scientific advisory board, and included George Church at Harvard and a bunch of people from Stanford and all these, pretty hefty scientists. And so up until the point, so early on, we'd have our meetings and we would talk theoretically about people getting their data and what that would mean. And they'd be all like scientists and weighing in with their ethical perspective and everything. And then we had this scientific advisory board meeting when they first got their data, and it was like a free for all. They were all like, what's your SNP genotype on this one? And oh, we should tell people all of this stuff. Their perspectives changed dramatically once they had that sense of, this is my data. So you can talk about it theoretically, but it's a completely different experience when it's actually you and looking at what makes you who you are. And their perspectives, it was dramatic how much they changed. It was very cool.
Yeah, so like right now 23andMe does more of like ancestry and heritage, if I'm correct. But do you see that moving more into like being able to detect like early onset of diseases based off of like your family history and stuff like that?
Well, certainly, and 23andMe does a lot of health-related reports as well. And if you remember the history or were aware of the history of the company, about I think it was 2013 because when we first launched, we gave people ancestry and health reports, and then the FDA stepped in and said, you got to stop on the health reports for now until you get them cleared through our process. And so the company kind of had to shut down all of those health-related reports. But my co-founder really stuck with it, and they hired some regulatory specialists who came in and knew the ropes of how to get that done. And so it took a while, but then finally, and now 23andMe is the only personal genetics company that has FDA clearance on health reports that don't require the intervention of a doctor. So you can still go online, you can order a kit, you can spit, you can get your data back, and you can get these reports now that have FDA clearance, and you don't have to have ever talked to a doctor. And that was a pretty remarkable hurdle that the company got over.
That's awesome. And all that just by like having the data, all that is possible. Yes. Wow, that's so crazy.
Yeah. Is there, I'm curious to know, is there like any synthesis of the data that you guys collect for like returning information on the health reports?
What do you mean
so like, you said that you're building up this like large database of people's like genetic information, right? Like how is that kind of played into what like consumers see from their end?
Well, so the first reports that we were able to put out to people were based on published research, right? So if there's this SNP in a gene and it means X, Y, or Z, and you've got that mutation, then here's your increased risk for a certain disease, right? So that came from the outside literature that we interpreted for our customers. But as the database got larger and larger, and we started doing the surveys out to people to collect their health information, there have been massive numbers of surveys and at least in the early days, I don't know if this is still true, but back then 80% of our customers would respond and answer the surveys. So once we would get certain numbers of people that said, yes, indeed, I've been diagnosed with a condition, now we had the makings of a genome-wide association study because we had the data, the genetic data, we had the phenotypic data, and now we could put those together. And then we would publish reports back to the consumers and say, and to the literature generally. I mean, there are a ton of publications now that have come out of 23andMe research, but we would send that back to people, and all of the people who contributed to the research who answered the survey questions, we acknowledged them in the papers. Of course, we couldn't put, 50,000 names of people in the actual research, but people would get badges that said, I contributed to a research study. So that's when the feedback loop started, that our own internal research was producing very interesting results.
Awesome. What are some of the most interesting things that you found, or some of the most like groundbreaking?
Well, I think there was one in particular that was, so there was already a known gene for Parkinson's disease that if you had that, it was more common in Ashkenazi Jewish population, but it pretty dramatically increased the risk for Parkinson's. So then we had that marker was in the database, and then we were able to look at across the people who had that mutation and then put out a survey to them to say, do you actually have Parkinson's, and got their age and all of that other additional information. And there were people who had the mutation who had never gone on to develop Parkinson's. And when they looked at those people compared to the people who did get Parkinson's, there was a gene identified, or a mutation in a gene. It looked like it was protective. So it was like these people carried around some kind of a protective gene that even though they had this other deleterious gene for Parkinson's, they never got the disease. So that became a marker that was interesting from a drug development perspective. So that was one of the health ones that came out of it. And I'm pretty sure 23andMe discovered why some people hate cilantro.
Really?
Yeah. So there was a discovery because it's such an easy survey to put out to people, and people they know immediately, like, do you like cilantro or not? And for most people, like, yeah, but the people who don't are like rabid about it. Like, I hate cilantro.
Yeah.
So there's clearly something going on in their taste buds that they hate it. And so it's been a while since I've looked into this, but I'm quite sure that was one of the discoveries that 23andMe made. So it runs the gamut disease-related research to pretty much just traits. But like in my family, I was really hoping we would discover the gene for left-handedness, because I'm in a family of 4 siblings. I'm the only one who's right-handed. And then I have 3 children, and 2 of my 3 kids are left-handed. I had an uncle lefty. I mean, there was so much left-handedness in my family, but I don't think that gene has been discovered, but it's clearly genetic.
Interesting. Wait, that's so funny because yeah, my sister absolutely like hates cilantro, and I think it's like
really?
completely fine. Yeah, so I'm curious to see like what is different in our genes.
Yeah, exactly. You should do, I don't know if you've done 23andMe, but you could find out.
Yeah, I haven't, but I think I might after this talk, because it's, yeah, I also want to contribute my data to your guys' research.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, and I think that, do you think that you would have like founded 23andMe if not for like the accessibility and like ease of using like saliva kits? So like, what if you hadn't found that day, and would it still have been made a possibility?
It's a really good question, because that's really where it seemed like now this could be a consumer product. Because if you've got to get blood from someone, that means a phlebotomist, it's way more difficult. And it's not enough DNA to do it out of a finger prick, which you can do obviously some blood tests out of a finger prick, but it's certainly not enough. Maybe now it would be enough. I kind of doubt it, but yeah, I mean, it was just simply providing a saliva sample just really turned on that consumer product light for me. So that was a huge factor.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, you said that the company that you found that was originally doing the saliva samples, what were they using it for?
Well, they were just selling the kits. So they just wanted to provide these plastic tubes basically with a stabilizer in it to research.
Oh.
And so they were out and they had gotten FDA clearance on it to show that it worked, that it stabilized the sample. And so they were selling these kits, and I stumbled across them at a trade show, and then they end up being, I think they've probably provided the lion's share of all the kits that have been sold, both through Ancestry and 23andMe. And that's like 30 million people now, I think. It's upwards of 30 million people who've done that. So it was I think I was probably pretty good for their business.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I actually had, as you were talking about like using your genetics to find certain like traits or susceptibility to diseases, have you guys done any research on like coronavirus and how like different people with different genes react to like
yes, so 23andMe, yeah, if you just do Google 23andMe and COVID, you'll pull up the work that's been done. And one thing that they seemed to discover was that certain blood types had higher and lower risk. So I think it's O positive, which is what I am. I remember reading it and being very happy because they said O positive looked like it puts you at lower risk for getting infected with COVID.
Interesting.
Yeah, so and then I think beyond that, they're now recruiting people to see if they can find any kind of genetic correlates to people who get severe disease versus people who can even kind of walk through it asymptomatically. So is there a genetic component to that? Right. It's obviously probably immune system related, and I don't know if the genetic data that 23andMe produces on each person covers the HLA region well enough to actually tease that out. So the immune system has its own challenges when it comes to the genetic study of it.
Oh, okay.
And a large part of your work, you're currently at Precisely now, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's awesome. And I feel like a large part of your work has been around this sort of idea of genetic empowerment. So how has that like played into like the work you currently do at Precisely?
Well, so we took a bit of a different tack. So my co-founder and I started looking actually into India and what are the opportunities in consumer genetics over there. And we went to India 7 times last year. So we were there a lot, and we learned that there's culturally, of course, it's very different, and different interests that people have in, for instance, looking at their ancestry, where, here in the US, a lot of people are like, yeah, I'd love to see, my family came from different parts of the world and they, we're this nice big melting pot. Whereas in India, most people were like, nah, I know my ancestry. I'm not curious about that. And they're really still very traditional when it comes to their medical information, that it really is best to come through the medical, the clinic, through doctors. And so this notion of doing things very independently online isn't necessarily that appealing. So we had to really think through the business model and I think change it up a lot. But it's still the same idea that we think people all over the world are just going to be curious about their genetic data. And of course in India, it's a bit different because people there pay out of pocket for, like, I think 70% of healthcare is paid for out of pocket. Right. So people are very choosy about how they spend those rupees, and they want to make sure that they're getting a lot of value. And so we've shifted our model around a bit for India that is also focused on prevention. And so can we look at the genetic profiles to see what people are at risk for, kind of broadly across different disease areas, and then use that information now to put them on a path for prevention. So that's really been our latest model. But of course we can't go to India now. So it's been a little challenging. So in the meantime, we've actually been pulled into potentially a study around post-COVID, where people, and you've probably heard about this, they call them the long haulers, who are the patients who don't fully recover. And then they can start to go down a track of looking like they have a syndrome that's very similar to chronic fatigue syndrome. So they're very tired, they have brain fog, they have a lot of immune system problems. And so the chronic fatigue community is actually pretty, I don't want to say excited, but now there's suddenly much more attention focused on their condition, which I've talked to the very few clinicians in the country who deal with these patients and work with them. And they really, now they're kind of calling it a post-viral syndrome, that people get an infection and they never get back to normal, or they have a hard time getting back to normal. And some of these patients have been sick for decades and they've never gotten better. And this condition does not get the attention it deserves. And so COVID now is shining a big bright light on this post-viral problem. So we're talking to people in that field to see if we can help in some way.
Right. So for people with these like chronic conditions, do you think that like early detection, or you mentioned that you were trying to help people put people on the path for that prevention using their genetic information. Do you think that that's like something possible with the work you're currently doing?
With the post-COVID, it's hard. I don't know. I don't have a lot of hope in genetics helping out so much in that area, but I think there are other things that we can look at. And there's a whole basket of symptoms. And if you can identify what symptoms a person has, there are things that can help them. And they're just more behavioral things. Like according to this clinician, she was saying that people who end up in this post-viral syndrome, almost all of them have what they call orthostatic intolerance. They can't stand on their feet for a very long time, and that's what's kind of sends them down this cascade of crashing. And simple things like either wearing compression stockings or putting your feet up very often during the day can help prevent you from going into a crash. So simple things like that. And if you do that religiously and you really pay attention to your body, and in fact, I'm hearing this now that some post-COVID patients are being put into physical therapy and like put on graduated exercise. So they're exercising more and more, which is exactly what they should not do. So there's misinformation out there. And, but again, I think because of COVID and all of these people now who are cropping up, it's almost becoming a national emergency. And so now we can finally get the resources, hopefully, and the right media attention. And, there've been articles in, I think, the Washington Post, Reuters, the World Economic Forum wrote about it. The head of the NIH blogged about it. So it's getting a lot of attention now, which is awesome. But again, the genetic component of it, I don't think is very clear.
Okay. Yeah, because I was thinking, like, I know a lot of young people these days, they don't see coronavirus as something that like directly impacts, because even if you, oh, did I cut out? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because a lot of young people think that, oh, even if I get COVID, I'll like recover from it right away, right? But like knowing the fact that like this affects people, like you're like tired most of the time, or like some people don't ever recover, like you mentioned. Like that's like really important to think about when before you like go out and be reckless with friends.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I couldn't caution people enough that this is so serious, no matter what age you are, because we're seeing this post-COVID condition in across the board. And honestly, I mean, if you looked up, Ron Davis is a researcher at Stanford, and he has a son, Whitney. And I think Whitney's now in his mid-30s. He's bedridden and has to be fed through a tube into his stomach with chronic fatigue syndrome. He probably got some kind of viral infection, never recovered, and he went so far downhill. And he's been in this state now for years, and there's nothing. And so Ron, a very famous genetics researcher, he converted all of his research over to chronic fatigue syndrome because he saw that it just wasn't getting the attention. And when you've got a son who can't get out of bed, can't talk, can't have bright lights in his room, has to be fed through a tube. I mean, come on, this is not in somebody's head. This isn't their imagination. This is a huge problem. And so that, I would never, ever, ever put myself, and I'd never want my children to put themselves at risk for that. So it's very serious. And I kind of had that same attitude when coronavirus first came on the scene in the very beginning part of this year. And I was almost hoping I would get it because then I'd have the antibodies and I'd be
right.
Not right. Oh my God, I've totally changed my tune. And as we're learning more, I think a lot of people are taking it far more seriously, but it's nothing to mess around with. No matter what you are.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think with a lot of like diseases and viruses, people have a lot of like misinformation about this thing. And like it seems to impact not only things like COVID-19, right? Like there's a lot of different cases in which this occurs. How do you like envision like society as a whole kind of tackling this issue in the future? It seems to be kind of like pressing.
Yeah. Well, you just wonder, what is normal life going to look like? And I think over in some of the Asian countries where wearing a mask was already pretty commonplace, I think more for just the environmental reasons. Whereas when we would go to India, nobody was wearing masks, and we would be in Delhi and the pollution was so heavy that you could barely breathe, but it wasn't culturally accepted to wear a mask. So nobody did. And we've seen now in the US what's different. People it's not unusual to be in this, I remember when you'd see a person with a mask on, I typically thought they were probably a cancer patient who was very immune compromised and, just was really trying to keep themselves healthy. And now, of course, masks are everywhere. So I really think this is our new normal, because it'll be really interesting to see as we go through a winter season and whether colds and the flu are lessened because of our behavior change now. And that could be it could be a good thing that we realize that. And I think there's going to be the whole fashion industry is going to go, well, they already are, around designing beautiful masks and crazy masks. And it's going to become a fashion statement. It already kind of has. But I think we're going to learn a lot more about how we prevent these things. And I think people will watch like movies back in the past and see, look at all those people walking around without masks on. What are they doing? I think whether good or bad, I think that's our new reality.
Yeah, for sure. I honestly don't mind, because then you can leave the house like maybe not looking your best. You just like slap on a mask.
Yeah. Sunglasses, mask. You're good to go.
Right.
Knows if you're smiling or not.
Right.
Yeah. I'm gonna redirect our attention to the Slido questions because we have a couple of hackers submitting a lot of questions. The most liked question right now is, how do you maintain the ethics and privacy of your customers? For instance, preventing insurance companies from discriminating based on pre-existing conditions.
So, that was something from the very start that we were very focused on. And very luckily, I think our head of engineering, when we first started 23andMe, came from PayPal. And he was hyper aware of privacy and security. And he took it upon himself to make sure that we built our systems in a way that would work for like a company like PayPal. And so I think that was a really fortunate thing for us. We were concerned about it, but he technically actually had the chops to build a system that we felt was very secure. Nothing's ever 100% secure either then, but it was really also about giving people their choice of like how much they wanted to expose themselves in the 23andMe database, especially when we put out the ancestry tools where you could find relatives. And we always made it an option for people to choose, what do you want to do? And I'll never forget, I went to a conference years ago, the Web 2.0, and they had a whole group of chief privacy officers there, and that was their number one thing. It's more about choice and giving people options and making them more in control and having agency over their own data. And so that was something we felt very strongly about. So people can always delete their data, they can download it, and giving them that ability to have some of that control. And then having them opt into the research part too. I mean, that's something that we ask every single person. Do you want to participate in the research? And luckily, I don't know what the percentage is now, but it's very high that most people are like, of course, I would love to contribute to the research. And then, there were a lot of things that came out in the press around like this identifying some of these criminals from the past, I forget what the guy's, what his name was here in California. Was it the Golden State Killer or something?
Oh,
anyway,
yeah, sounds familiar.
Yeah, they identified him by going not into 23andMe or Ancestry or some of these private companies, but there was this sort of a public resource database where people could upload their genetic data. But you could upload any genetic data and do a comparison against everybody else in the database. And that's how they actually identified this guy. And 23andMe never allows anything like that. So, but then when it comes to the insurance companies, for one thing, there was a law that was passed right about the time we launched the company back in 2007 called GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed almost, I think almost, there was like one guy in the House who voted against it, but it got overwhelming support in the House and the Senate, and the president signed it. And so but that's health insurers that can't discriminate. It doesn't cover life insurance or long-term care insurance, but to date, as far as I know, we've never seen an insurance company deny anyone any coverage based on genetic data. Because I think they know there would just be, because we've got this law and there's a precedent for it for health insurance, that if it ever happened in these other areas, that there would be an outcry and the law. And I don't know if there are people pushing to get this expanded out to these other insurance providers, but that would make sense to me.
Right. And I think that like as like a part of it being like a consumer product where you would receive, you give something and then you receive something back, like that does make it, that definitely does feel like a choice to me.
Yeah. And again, if people want to get their reports and then delete their data and just be done, I think there is, that then you're out of the system, you're not findable, and it gives people that control if they feel that strongly about it. But I think that's been very rare where people have deleted their data out of the system, because they continue to get updates and new reports that come out as new studies are published. And so it has that dynamic feel. And I think and you get new relatives if you're into that. I think of the number of stories that have come out of 23andMe of people finding relatives that they never knew about, like adoptees finding family members. It's just been phenomenal. And that seems to have really caught the attention of the press a lot, because they're just these human interest stories, right? Of people identifying folks that and it's really been amazing. Like even in Korea, I think we found, these sisters found each other. They were adopted here in the US, but they were originally from Korea, I believe. And they found each other, which is just, it's insane. That's, that's possible, but the data just paved the way for all kinds of these interesting discoveries.
Yeah, we got to have everyone start spitting in tubes.
That company will be happy you said that.
Yeah, I'm helping them out. Yeah, I know like it's a big deal right now with big tech and like the government. A lot about privacy, like for example, the San Bernardino shooting with like Apple and trying to get into his iPhone, stuff like that. Do you ever see like a situation like extreme enough where you would open up like the database for like a certain, like if something happened, I don't know what, like any situation?
And so I'm not at the company, so I'm luckily not in that position.
Right.
But I think, just knowing what I do about my co-founder and her philosophy around this is it's of utmost importance to protect the privacy of the person, of the people in the database. And so I can't even imagine something so extreme, because, you see Apple in that position, and you really have to make that hard choice of what's the priority here. And I really can't come up with a scenario where I would see that happening.
Right. Yeah, because then you open up like a whole box of issues, like what like counts as like, valid
channels. And I think that's what they found through that. I think it's called GEDmatched, where they do allow you to upload any data set. It doesn't have to be your own, and then that's what gets compared to everyone else in this large database. And so just having that capability and that function is what allowed this to happen. Whereas at 23andMe, they've locked it down so tightly that there's no way you can compare one person to a bunch of other people, and it's way more protected than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. We've got we've got a lot of questions in the Slido. So here's one from an anonymous asker. The popular belief now is, with the advance of technology, the rich can pay to live much longer, if not forever. What do you think of this?
Oh, wow. I wish that were true, and I wish I had enough money to do that. Actually, I've been in several conferences where they have you hold up your hand, like, would you want to live to 100? Would you want to live to 150? And I was really surprised how many people were kind of okay to 100. And a lot of people just didn't seem that interested in that kind of longevity. So I think that's the bigger question, like, what will your life be like? And what would you want to do for that long? And would you be able to save enough money to live that long? And it raises so many questions. And we're so far from that I think the benefits of the longevity research that's going on now is that we're actually finding, hopefully, treatments and things that affect the elderly, so that they can live longer and healthier. But it's more of an emphasis on the healthier side. So I would say I'm in that camp where I just want to live as healthy as long as I can. I don't want to just live as long as I can. And that's the big question mark, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, if you can't do anything and you can't enjoy like the things in life, there's really no point in staying alive for that long.
Yeah, like people say there's like a lot of value in like knowing your time is short, I guess. Like, you tend to value what you're currently doing more, I think.
Yeah, and you set your priorities in such a way, and you enjoy your life as it is. And but I do think maybe 200 years from now, maybe people will be living closer to 150, possibly. But we're also stuck in these bodies, and you can do things, but the whole aging process is going to be a lot to hack. Maybe your hackers can start working on that.
Right. We should inspire them to work on this project.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have a question here. What's the future of biotech? Do you see any recent developments in the field being incorporated into Precisely and/or 23andMe?
That's a good question. So, of course, the whole CRISPR thing and Cas9, where you can go in and actually edit DNA, I think is it's clearly a huge development, and it's pretty recent. I don't know that it'll be anything that will be apparent in these consumer companies. I think it's much more going to come through the traditional flow of biotech developing drugs that end up in the clinic, and getting tested and then being prescribed by doctors, because that's pretty hefty stuff to think about editing your genetics. So I don't think that paradigm is going to shift anytime soon, because I think that's appropriate. And it also needs to be discussed in the scientific community, what the ethics around things, and society has to make decisions over how we use these very powerful tools. And I wouldn't want to see that just become something that just gets thrown into the consumer world. I don't think that's appropriate.
Right. And gene editing, it seems to be like something that gets more possible with every day. And I know that I'm not sure if you heard of it, but it was maybe a couple years ago, in China they had these like gene edited babies.
Designer babies, yeah.
Designer babies, yeah. What did you think of that?
Well, just the whole way it was carried out it was pretty shocking, I think, to everyone, and it didn't seem to go through the proper ethical channels. And then there were unintended consequences. I don't know if you followed it, but they realized, and I kind of forget what the details were, but I think they gave the twins this CCR5 mutation, which makes them immune to HIV, because apparently the father had HIV or had AIDS, but then there were the unintended consequences. I think it put the twins at a higher risk for, was it some kind of a cancer or something? I forget, but that's the thing, is you go in and muck around in the genetics and you think you're giving somebody a positive thing, but you have no idea what the follow-on effects are going to be, because it just hasn't been studied. So sometimes going a little bit slower, I think, makes a lot of sense. But I did hear some murmurings from the scientific community, like, what's the big deal? We knew this was going to happen, and now the cat's out of the bag and it's going to be happening all over the place. So I don't know that that's true, but I would err on the side of taking it slower and being more careful about it.
Yeah, and like with gene therapy, I'm not sure if it's quite considered gene therapy, but I know that there are some like nasal inhales for certain like diseases that can temporarily alleviate some conditions. Like how far do you think we should go with like gene therapy, if ever? And because it seems like it could have some potential benefits in the future.
Oh, for sure. I'm all for research. And, again, that's the biotech community is really geared toward that. And I know investors who only focus on gene therapies. I mean, it's so promising. So for sure. And, whatever the mechanism for delivery is, whatever the most effective delivery you can use, I'm 100% for that. I think it could help a lot of people.
Yeah. Let's see. Another Slido question. How long do you think it'll take for genomic sequencing to cost pennies?
Well, I mean, so the question really, if you talk about doing, sequencing an entire genome, it's all about the depth of the sequencing that you do, which improves your accuracy, right? So people talk about like doing a 1x, which means you've just done a one pass across the genome, and the data are okay, but they're not great, versus doing like a 30x or a 100x. And that's when you start to get into diagnostic level, where you can actually call each base very, very confidently. So I think we're going to get down, it's already getting so inexpensive to do a low pass sequence, maybe sub $100. Which is insane. It cost $3 billion to do the first one back in the late 90s, 2000. So pennies, yeah, we may get there, but then it's sort of like what's the value of the data then? And I think people are going to be more focused on high quality data at low cost. Where if we could do a 30x genome for $100, now we're talking about really inexpensive diagnostics, or maybe even $50 at some point. That's when you get in the range where every individual could potentially afford to get their own high quality genome sequence done and then available for so many purposes. So that's, I think, where the field is headed. I think that's a more realistic way to look at it, rather than how cheap can it get, because at that point it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there's another question on the Slido. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, what do you think of personalized medicine, aka tailoring people's medical treatments based on their genetic composition? What do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, you can look at it from a couple of different angles. Like, so one aspect is we process drugs differently based on like our liver enzymes. And so if you take a drug and it works great, I take that drug and I have a severe reaction. And there is probably a genetic component to that. So once we understand who's going to have the really bad reaction, and we can weed them out by looking at their genomes, that aspect of pharmacogenetics has been a glimmer in the eye of the FDA and a lot of these tech companies, because then, that's one of the problems when a drug gets approved. Then you have to do the follow-on of who's going to potentially have a severe reaction. And sometimes you won't see that until hundreds, if not thousands, of people are on the drug. And then suddenly it's like, oh my God, this person went into liver failure from this drug, and we didn't see that coming. So the sooner you can get to that, and some people can be doing really, really well on that drug, but it may have to get pulled off the market because we can't differentiate these people who do well versus don't do well. So that's one aspect. And then the other is just the efficacy of the drug. Does it work really well in some people and maybe not so well in some people? It's kind of the same idea, but sometimes those genetics can be quite different about the mechanism of action of the drug. Does it get into the cell? All these different components. So it's a very interesting field. It's really hard because kind of like the problem I spoke about earlier, where statistical power is really hard. If you're looking for, one person out of 500 who had a very severe reaction, looking at their genome compared to, it's just, you're not probably going to find what you're looking for until you get the numbers up enough to have the power genetically to find it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see, looking through these questions. Yeah, you mentioned technology earlier. Someone asked, does current capital investment favor more consumption-related technologies, for example, mobile phones and driverless cars, than research into human health / the disease issue?
Well, luckily we have the NIH, which funds, I forget what their budget, like 30 billion or something like that. So it's phenomenal how much money this country pumps into research. So that's on the research side. And then there's a very healthy investment community around biotech and pharma and digital health. I mean, digital health this year has gotten funding, record funding. So I think there's plenty of investment dollars going in. In fact, I think sometimes almost too many companies get funded because there's such an excess of capital. And between Boston and San Francisco and other parts of the country, but we are the two primary sources of funding, the venture funding, and there's just massive capital to be spread around. So I don't see that as an issue. And obviously tech gets a lot of funding as well, but a lot of tech investors are interested in coming in over to the bio side. So, which is a little scary sometimes, where they don't necessarily understand the science behind things and can tend to get a little bit over enthusiastic, but they're just getting better and better. And a lot of the tech funds are hiring people who have the expertise. So it's very encouraging, but it's an exciting space. And what's different about the bio area and health in general is that it's so personal to everyone. Who doesn't want to see advancements in disease research and such, and especially if they have something in their family. I mean, that's without a doubt such a big motivator for people to invest in biotech.
Right.
Yeah.
And I wanted to circle back on something you said earlier about statistical power of like the research. So there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of diseases that are super rare and very uncommon and hard to find. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where we'll have enough statistical power to address almost like all of the diseases that are, even the ones that are rare?
So rare disease is fascinating. And this is an area where what I talked about, the full genome sequencing, when you do deep sequence and you get a really high quality data set, typically what's done, like if a baby is born and we can't identify what's wrong with the child, they will do the sequencing of the trio, right? They do both parents and the child. Mm-hmm. And now that sequencing costs have dropped to a point where we can get this high quality data and do those comparisons, mm-hmm. Between the parents and the child, you can very quickly point to what does that child have that's different from the parents. And so it really gives a way to really hone in on what might be the genetic cause of that condition, of that rare condition. So if there's a genetic basis to it, I think we've got a lot more power now with the these sequencing technologies and being able to just and the computational power we have now too. So those are different cases than trying to because, and then also if the penetrance of the genetics into that condition are really high and strong, meaning it is very clearly a genetic condition, then you have a much better shot at finding it. Versus when you're looking at common disease, which that's genetics is just sometimes a small piece of it, and the environmental effect it can be large. So those are the tougher studies, because that's when you need the higher power, because you're looking for something that isn't so, the penetrance of it isn't so strong that there are so many other factors to be weighed. So those, and it's usually multiple genes involved, maybe sometimes 100 genes working in concert. And that's where it gets difficult, and you need to have many more people enrolled in the studies. So we're getting better and better, and we have these large databases now, like 23andMe and Ancestry, and so we have a lot more data to be looking into.
So for these like particular rare diseases, it's really more about like what's the quality of genetic data that we derive to be able to like analyze this.
Yeah, and again, if it is a genetics problem, then we, there are strategies around that are very usually quite successful, and they're able to hone in on that part of the genome in the child. And then once you know that, because there are some diseases that are being discovered that are, there's a handful of people in the world who have them, but now with the power of these databases and being able to look globally, and you can start to compare to data. And I think there's been a lot of good standardization around this. Now you can find families in other parts, halfway around the world that have that exact same genetic mutation, and the same resulting effect on typically a baby is where we see it. And it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Like all the possibilities are really promising, and I'm so glad that we got to like talk to you about this, because this is like something that, like, as a computer science student, I don't really know much about, but I think first thing I'm going to do is like sign up for 23andMe, and hopefully hopefully like things will like I can't wait to see where this field goes. We actually like went quite over time, but thank you so much, Linda, for joining us today. If you could stay on really quick after the call, that'd be great too. But I just want to tell our hackers that we have another fireside chat with Tom Preston Werner. Check the Slack for the link, and I'll see you guys at closing tomorrow.